The autumn wind carried screams across the Hillcrest Farm as a massive black stallion reared against the sky, hooves slashing the air like weapons forged from shadow and fury. Walter Bennett stood motionless in the center of the corral, an old man whose weathered face betrayed nothing while chaos erupted around him. The crowd pressed against the rails, voices rising in panic and anger, demanding the animal be destroyed before it killed someone. But Walt's eyes never left the horse. In that charged moment, with dust swirling and tension crackling like electricity before a storm, he did something that silenced every voice, stilled every heart, and changed everything anyone thought they knew about broken things and the men who refused to give up on them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The September morning broke cold over the Kentucky hills, fog clinging to the hollows like something that had forgotten how to let go. Walter Bennett woke to the sound of his own breathing in a house that had grown too large for one man. The bedroom still held traces of Margaret, her brush on the dresser, the quilt she'd stitched spread across the bed they'd shared for 42 years. He didn't move those things. Moving them would be admitting she wasn't coming back, and even after 3 years, that admission stuck in his throat like a stone he couldn't swallow. He dressed slowly, pulling on the same flannel shirt he'd worn yesterday, the same worn jeans that bore stains from a decade of work. His hands ached in the morning now, knuckles swollen from years of gripping reins and hammers and fence posts, from holding on to things that wanted to slip away. The mirror showed him a face he barely recognized, carved deep with lines that mapped every loss, every winter, every promise he'd failed to keep. The kitchen table was set for one. It had been set for one since Maggie passed, since the cancer had taken her inch by inch while he stood helpless, watching the light fade from her eyes. He boiled water for coffee, the kettle's whistle piercing the silence, and stood at the window looking out over land that had belonged to his family for 4 generations. The barn rose red and fading against the gray sky, paint peeling like old skin. Beyond it, the pastures rolled away in waves of green turning gold, bordered by split-rail fencing that sagged in places where he hadn't found the strength to mend it. His son's photograph hung above the stove, forever frozen at 19, grinning with that wild confidence of boys who think they're immortal. Thomas had died on a rain-slicked road 12 years ago, his truck wrapped around an oak tree on Old Mill Road. Walt had been the one to identify the body. He'd been the one to tell Maggie, "Some wounds don't close, they just get covered over with scar tissue that aches when the weather changes." He drank his coffee black and bitter, standing because sitting at the empty table made the silence louder. Through the window, he watched the mist beginning to lift, revealing the shapes of the world piece by piece. The barn, the fence line, the old stone well where Maggie used to draw water before they'd put in the pump. Everything here whispered her name. Everything here reminded him of what used to be. The phone rang, shattering his thoughts. He let it ring 3 times before answering, already knowing who it would be. Victor Drummond's voice came through smooth as oil on water. "Morning, Walt. Hope I'm not calling too early." Walt said nothing, waiting. Victor never called to chat. "I'm heading into Meadowbrook this morning," Victor continued, his tone carefully casual. "Thought I might swing by, have another conversation about your property. The offer still stands. In fact, I'm prepared to sweeten it." "Not interested," Walt said, the words flat and final. There was a pause, the kind that suggested Victor was smiling on the other end. "You're a stubborn man, Walt. I respect that. But stubbornness doesn't pay the bills. I know about the medical debts, the mortgage you took out when Maggie got sick. Pride's one thing, but poverty's another." Walt's jaw tightened. "I said no." "Think about it," Victor pressed. "You're sitting on prime land, and you're out here alone playing shepherd to ghosts. Sell to me, take the money, go somewhere easier. You've earned rest." "Goodbye, Victor." Walt hung up before the other man could respond. His hand trembled slightly as he set the receiver down. Victor wasn't wrong about the debts. The hospital bills from Maggie's final months had crushed him, even with insurance. He'd mortgaged the farm to pay for treatments that bought her 6 more months of pain. Now the bank sent letters with increasing frequency, polite words wrapped around threats. He was 3 months behind. maybe 4. He'd stopped opening the envelopes. He pulled on his boots and stepped outside into air that smelled of damp earth and fading wildflowers. The farm stretched before him, 200 acres of rolling pasture and woodland that his great-grandfather had cleared with his own hands. Every fence post, every stone in the barn foundation, carried the sweat of Bennett blood. Selling it to Victor Drummond, a man who saw land only as investment, as numbers on a spreadsheet, would be like selling his own bones. The barn door creaked as he pushed it open, the sound familiar as his own heartbeat. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of hay and leather and old wood. His remaining animals, 3 aging cows and a pair of goats, stirred in their stalls. He'd sold most of the livestock over the past 2 years, unable to maintain the herd alone. What remained were the ones he couldn't bear to part with, the ones Maggie had named. He was forking hay when he heard the truck coming up the drive, tires crunching on gravel. He leaned the pitchfork against the wall and walked out to meet James Pritchard, the livestock broker from town. James climbed out of his pickup, a stocky man with a face like weathered boot leather and eyes that calculated value in everything they saw. "Walt," James said, nodding. "Got a proposition for you." Walt crossed his arms, waiting. "There's a horse," James began, then paused, choosing his words carefully. "Black Stallion, maybe 5 years old. Came through the auction last week. Nobody could handle him. Attacked 2 handlers, nearly killed a man in Lexington who tried to break him. Owner gave up, wanted him destroyed. And," Walt's voice was neutral. "I bought him," James said. "Figured maybe he just needed the right hand. But I was wrong. He's beyond saving, Walt. Mean clear through. I'm having him put down this afternoon unless—" He trailed off, studying Walt's face. "Unless what?" "Unless you'll take him. Free. I know you got away with difficult animals. Always have. If anyone can save him, it's you. But I gotta be honest, I don't think even you can reach this one. He's got the devil in him." Walt was quiet for a long moment, looking past James toward the empty pastures. He thought of the bills stacked on his kitchen counter, the final notices, the weight of this place pressing down on him like a hand on his chest. Another mouth to feed made no sense. A dangerous horse made even less. "Bring him by," Walt said finally. James blinked, surprised. "You sure? This ain't some spooked colt. This animal wants to hurt people. Bring him by this afternoon." After James left, Walt stood in the yard, wondering what he'd just agreed to. The rational part of his mind said he was a fool. But there was another part, the part that had watched his wife fade and his son die and his farm slip toward ruin, that recognized something in the description of that horse. Something broken beyond what most people could see. Something that fought because fighting was all it knew. The afternoon sun was high when James returned, pulling a trailer that rocked and shuddered with the violence inside it. The sounds coming from within were unlike anything Walt had heard from a horse, shrieks of rage mixed with the thunder of hooves. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Hooves against metal. The trailer itself bore dents from the inside, testament to the fury contained within. "He's been like this the whole drive," James said, his face pale. "Walt, last chance to change your mind. This animal's dangerous." Walt shook his head and walked toward the corral he'd prepared, checking the gate, the height of the rails. Behind him, James maneuvered the trailer into position. The sounds from inside grew more frantic. "I'm gonna back up to the gate," James called. "When I open it, he's gonna come out fast. Stay clear." Walt nodded and stepped back, positioning himself where he could see but wouldn't be in the immediate path. James climbed onto the trailer, his movements careful, and pulled the latch. The door swung open. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the Black Stallion exploded into the world like something born from nightmare. He was massive, 17 hands at least, his coat so dark it seemed to absorb light. His eyes rolled white with terror and rage, and the scars that crossed his hide told stories Walt could read like a book written in pain. This horse had been beaten, starved, broken in every way except the one that mattered. The stallion hit the corral at a full gallop, screaming. hooves churning dirt as he raced the perimeter looking for escape. He slammed into the rails with his shoulder, wood groaning under the impact. Then he reared, striking at the air, at the fence, at the world itself. James had retreated to his truck. "He's all yours, Walt. Good luck. You're gonna need it." As the truck pulled away, Walt stood watching the horse destroy itself against the boundaries of the corral. The stallion's rage was total, consuming, a fire that fed on its own heat. But beneath the rage, Walt saw something else. He saw fear so deep it had calcified into fury. He saw a creature that had learned the only safety was in violence, that trust was a trap, that gentleness was a lie that preceded pain. The horse finally stopped, sides heaving, foam dripping from his muzzle. He stood in the center of the corral, head high, nostrils flared, every muscle coiled. His eyes found Walt, and in them was a promise of violence, a challenge, a warning. Walt didn't move. He stood at the fence, hands loose at his sides, and simply watched. He didn't approach. He didn't speak. He just offered his presence, patient and undeniable as stone. The standoff lasted until the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson. The horse never took his eyes off Walt. Walt never looked away. It was the beginning of something, though whether it would end in salvation or disaster, neither man nor beast could say. As darkness gathered, Walt finally turned and walked toward the house. Behind him, the black stallion screamed into the coming night, a sound of defiance and despair that echoed across the empty hills. Walt paused at his door, looking back. The horse was a shadow against shadows now, still standing, still watching, still ready to fight the world. Inside, Walt sat at the kitchen table with Maggie's photograph in his hands. "I know," he whispered to her image. "I know it's crazy, but I looked at him and I saw us. I saw what happens when everything's been taken and all you got left is the fight." He set the picture down gently and moved to the window. The barn light cast a weak glow across the yard. Beyond it, in the corral, the black stallion paced, a restless spirit trapped in flesh, unable to settle, unable to trust the ground beneath his hooves. Walt pressed his forehead against the cool glass. Tomorrow would come with its own trials. Victor would call again, or the bank would send another letter, or the horse would hurt himself trying to escape. But tonight, in this moment, Walt had made a choice. He'd taken in something broken, something everyone else had given up on, and maybe in doing so, he'd given himself a reason to keep standing. The horse screamed again, the sound carrying through the walls, and Walt closed his eyes, listening, understanding in a way he couldn't articulate that this was meant to be. Two broken things, circling each other in the dark, neither knowing if redemption was possible, but both too stubborn to stop trying. The morning after the stallion's arrival broke with a fog so thick it turned the world into something half-remembered, shapes emerging from white like thoughts surfacing through sleep. Walter Bennett woke before dawn, his body trained by decades to rise when darkness still held the land. He lay for a moment listening to the silence of the house, that particular quality of quiet that comes from living alone, and then pushed himself upright, joints protesting the cold that had settled into the room overnight. His first thought was of the horse. He moved to the window and peered through the condensation coating the glass, trying to make out the corral through the soup of fog. Nothing was visible beyond 20 feet. Somewhere out there, the black stallion waited, and Walt felt a tightness in his chest that might have been anticipation or dread or some mixture of both. He dressed in layers, the cold seeping through the old farmhouse walls like water through cracked stone. The floor creaked under his weight as he made his way to the kitchen, each sound amplified by the emptiness around him. He didn't bother with breakfast, just filled a thermos with coffee and grabbed his work gloves from the hook by the door. Outside, the fog swallowed him whole. It pressed against his skin, damp and invasive, turning everything beyond arm's reach into suggestion rather than certainty. His boots found the path by memory, following the worn track from house to barn that his feet had carved over 40 years. The grass on either side was heavy with dew, each blade bent under the weight of moisture it carried. The barn materialized gradually, its red walls fading into existence like a photograph developing. Walt pushed through the door and was greeted by the warm animal smell of the cows and goats, their breathing creating small clouds in the cold air. They stirred at his entrance, expecting food, expecting routine. He moved through the familiar motions of feeding them, his hands working while his mind stayed focused on what waited beyond these walls. When he could delay no longer, he filled a bucket with grain and another with fresh water, hooked a coil of rope over his shoulder, and stepped back into the fog. The walk to the corral felt longer than it should have, each step taking him deeper into whiteness that seemed to have no end. Then the fence rails appeared, dark lines cutting through pale nothing, and beyond them, a shape that resolved itself into the black stallion. The horse stood in the exact center of the corral, head high, ears pinned flat against his skull. Even through the fog, Walt could see the tension in every line of the animal's body, coiled tight as a spring wound to breaking. The stallion's coat was slick with moisture, making him look carved from obsidian, a statue of rage frozen in the moment before violence. Walt approached slowly, making no sudden movements, and hung the water bucket on the fence post. He could feel the horse watching him, could sense the calculation happening behind those dark eyes. Every prey animal had to decide between flight and fight. This one had decided long ago, and the scars that marked his hide were evidence of how many times he'd chosen wrong and survived anyway. Setting the grain bucket down, Walt stepped back and leaned against the fence, arms crossed loosely over his chest. He didn't try to enter the corral, didn't reach out or make soothing sounds. He just stood, offering nothing but his presence, patient as the fog that wrapped around them both. The stallion's nostrils flared, testing the air, sorting through the smells for threat or deception. His muscles quivered with the effort of standing still when every instinct screamed to attack or flee. Minutes passed. The fog began to thin as the sun climbed behind its curtain, and slowly the world expanded around them, revealing the pastures beyond the corral, the barn, the distant house. Walt remained motionless. This was the first lesson, the only lesson that mattered. He was not a threat. He was not going to force or demand or hurt. He was simply there, as reliable as the fence posts, as unchanging as the ground. The horse finally moved, a single step toward the water bucket, then another. His head swung toward Walt, ears flicking forward and back, reading for any sign of aggression. Walt kept his breathing steady, his posture relaxed. The stallion reached the bucket and drank, never taking his eyes off the man, ready to explode into motion at the slightest provocation. When the horse had drunk his fill, he backed away quickly, retreating to his position in the center of the corral. Walt nodded slightly, as if accepting this small victory, and pushed off from the fence. He walked away without looking back, leaving the grain untouched. Let the horse approach on his own terms. Let him learn that Walt's presence didn't always mean confrontation. Back at the house, Walt stood at the kitchen sink and washed his hands, watching through the window as the fog continued to burn away. The land revealed itself in stages, the near pastures first, then the fence lines, finally the tree line that marked the eastern boundary of his property. This was the world he'd inherited, the world he'd promised to protect, and it was slipping through his fingers like that fog, impossible to hold. The mail truck arrived mid-morning, its appearance marked by the sound of gravel under tires and the metallic complaint of the mailbox opening and closing. Walt waited a full 5 minutes before walking out to collect what had been delivered, as if delaying would change the contents. 3 envelopes waited, and he knew their nature before opening them. The first was from the bank, the word "final" printed in red across the top. The second was from the hospital billing department. The third was from Victor Drummond's attorney. He carried them inside and spread them on the kitchen table like cards in a losing hand. The bank letter gave him 30 days to bring the mortgage current or face foreclosure proceedings. The hospital wanted payment on the remaining balance of Margaret's care, a sum that made his vision blur when he tried to focus on the numbers. Victor's attorney laid out an offer to purchase the property, the language cold and precise, describing his land in terms of acreage and tax assessments, reducing 4 generations of Bennett history to a legal description and a dollar amount. Walt sat down heavily, feeling the weight of these papers as if they were made of lead rather than wood pulp and ink. He'd been dodging this reckoning for months, telling himself that something would change, that some solution would present itself. But solutions didn't materialize out of hope. They required action, and he had no action left to take. The sound of a vehicle approaching pulled him from these dark thoughts. Through the window, he saw Lillian Brooks' rust-spotted sedan making its way up the drive, moving slowly as if uncertain of its welcome. Walt felt a mix of gratitude and shame. Lillian had been Margaret's closest friend, and after Maggie's death, she'd appointed herself guardian of Walt's well-being, stopping by with food, with conversation, with a stubborn refusal to let him disappear into grief. He met her at the door as she climbed out, carrying a covered dish that steamed in the cool air. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, with gray hair she wore in a practical bun and eyes that missed nothing. She'd taught 3rd grade at Meadowbrook Elementary for 37 years, and she carried that teacher's ability to see through excuses and evasions. "Don't tell me you've eaten today," she said by way of greeting, not waiting for an invitation before stepping past him into the house. "You look like a scarecrow, Walt Bennett." "Morning, Lillian," he said, closing the door behind her. "You didn't have to go to trouble. If I waited for you to ask for help, you'd starve." She set the dish on the stove and turned to face him, arms crossed. "I heard about the horse. James Pritchard's wife told me at the grocery. Said you took in that devil stallion everyone else wanted destroyed." Walt moved to the coffee pot, needing something to do with his hands. "Horse needs a chance. Horse needs to be put down before he kills someone." Lillian's voice was sharp, but her eyes were worried. "Walt, you're not a young man anymore. What are you trying to prove?" "Not trying to prove anything." He poured 2 cups of coffee and handed her one. "Just seemed wrong is all. Everyone giving up on him." Lillian accepted the cup and studied him over its rim. "This about the horse or about you?" The question hung in the air between them, too honest to deflect. Walt looked away, out the window toward the corral where the stallion was barely visible as a dark shape against the fence. "Line. Maybe both." She sighed, the sound carrying years of watching people she cared about make difficult choices. "Margaret would worry about you taking this on. Maggie would understand. Understanding and approving are different things." Lillian set her cup down and gestured toward the papers spread on the table. "Those what I think they are?" Walt nodded, unable to meet her eyes. She moved to the table and scanned the letters, her lips pressing into a thin line. When she looked up, her expression had softened from criticism to concern. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough. Victor Drummond's been circling this place like a buzzard for 2 years, she said. "Ever since Maggie got sick and word got out about the medical bills. He's got half the valley already, buying up farms from folks who can't keep up with taxes or maintenance. Turns them into horse farms for rich people from Louisville, or subdivides them for vacation homes. Nothing stays what it was." Walt knew this. He'd watched it happen to the Morrison place, then the Chun property, then the old Blackwell farm. Each time, Victor had come in with cash offers that desperate people couldn't refuse, and each time, the land had been transformed into something unrecognizable, something that served wealth rather than work. "I won't sell to him," Walt said, the words carrying more certainty than he felt. "This land's been Bennett land since 1847. My great-grandfather cleared it with his own hands. Maggie's buried here. Tommy." He couldn't finish the sentence. Lillian reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "I know, Walt, but pride doesn't pay bills, and stubbornness doesn't stop foreclosure. If you lose the farm to the bank, Victor will buy it at auction for pennies. You'll get nothing, and the land will be his anyway." The truth of this settled over him like a weight. He'd been so focused on refusing Victor's offers that he hadn't fully confronted the alternative. The bank would take the farm. Victor would buy it. The result would be the same, except he'd lose everything and gain nothing. "There has to be another way," he said, but even he could hear the hollowness in the words. Lillian stood and moved to the window, looking out at the land that rolled away toward the horizon. "Maggie used to say this place had a spirit to it. said she could feel it in the ground, in the air. She believed the land would provide if you listened close enough. She turned back to face him. I don't know if that's true, Walt, but I know she'd want you to fight. Not just to keep the land, but to keep yourself. You've been disappearing since she died. Fading like old paint. That horse out there, dangerous as he is, he's the first thing I've seen you care about in 3 years. After Lillian left, having extracted a promise that he'd eat the casserole she'd brought, Walt walked back out to the corral. The fog had burned away completely now, leaving the day clear and sharp. The stallion stood at the far end of the enclosure, head turned to watch Walt's approach, body still coiled with tension but not quite as tightly as before. The grain bucket remained untouched where Walt had left it hours ago. He picked it up and emptied it into the trough mounted on the fence, then refilled the water bucket from the pump near the barn. These simple actions, repeated and predictable, were their own form of communication. The horse would learn that Walt's presence meant food and water, meant meeting needs rather than causing pain. As Walt worked, the stallion tracked his movements with those dark, intelligent eyes. There was calculation in that gaze, a weighing of threat and opportunity. Horses were prey animals, their survival dependent on correctly reading danger in every situation. This one had learned to see danger everywhere, in every human gesture, every offered hand. Unlearning that would take more than grain and water. It would take time Walt wasn't sure he had. The afternoon brought another visitor, this one less welcome. The sheriff's cruiser rolled up the drive shortly after lunch, and Walt felt his stomach tighten. Daniel Hayes had been sheriff of the county for 15 years, a fair man who'd gone to school with Walt's son, who'd been a pallbearer at Thomas's funeral. But fairness didn't make the visits easier when they came on official business. Daniel climbed out of the cruiser, his uniform crisp despite the dust that coated everything in autumn. He was tall, built like the college football player he'd once been, with a face that showed the miles of dealing with other people's troubles. He raised a hand in greeting, but his expression was serious. "Walt," he said, approaching. "Got a minute?" "Always got time for you, Daniel." Walt gestured toward the porch, and they settled into the worn chairs that had been there since Walt's father's time. Daniel removed his hat and turned it in his hands, the gesture of a man organizing difficult words. "I got a call this morning from Victor Drummond's office. His attorney wanted to file a complaint about the horse you acquired yesterday. Said it's a danger to the community, that it should be destroyed for public safety." Walt felt anger kindle in his chest, hot and sharp. "That horse hasn't been off my property. Hasn't been near anyone but me." "I know that," Daniel said quickly, "and I told them as much. But Victor's got influence, Walt. He's on the county board, he's got connections. If he pushes this, there could be an order to have the animal destroyed." "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that it's attacked multiple people in the past month. James Pritchard's records show 2 handlers injured, and that incident in Lexington put a man in the hospital." Daniel leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Walt, I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here as a friend. Victor wants your land. He'll use anything he can to pressure you into selling. This horse gives him leverage." Walt stared out at the corral where the stallion stood, head high, ears forward, as if listening to the conversation. "That horse hasn't done anything wrong since arriving here. Yet," Daniel said. "Walt, I've known you my whole life. You're a good man and you've got a gift with animals. But this isn't some spooked colt or a stubborn mule. This is a dangerous animal with a history of violence. If something happens, if it gets loose and hurts someone, I won't be able to protect you." The words settled heavy between them. Walt knew Daniel was right. The stallion was dangerous. Any honest assessment had to acknowledge that. But danger wasn't the same as evil, and violence wasn't the same as irredeemable. "I'll keep him contained," Walt said finally. "He won't be a threat to anyone." Daniel studied him for a long moment, then nodded and stood. "All right, but Walt, be careful. Victor's not going to stop pushing, and if he can't get you out one way, he'll find another." After the sheriff left, Walt walked the perimeter of his property, something he hadn't done in months. The fence line was in worse shape than he'd realized. Posts leaned at angles, wire sagged whole. Sections needed replacing. It would take weeks of work to bring it up to standard, and he'd need materials he couldn't afford. Every direction he looked showed decay, neglect, the slow erosion of a place he no longer had the strength or resources to maintain alone. He ended up at the small cemetery on the hill behind the house, where 3 generations of Bennetts lay beneath simple stones. Margaret's grave was marked by a granite marker he'd chosen with care, selecting words that felt inadequate to contain who she'd been. Beloved wife and mother, it read, as if those words could capture the woman who'd taught him what love meant, who'd raised their son with fierce tenderness, who'd faced death with more grace than he'd faced life since losing her. Thomas's stone stood beside hers, and Walt knelt between them, one hand on each marker. The stone was cold under his palms, solid, final. "I don't know what I'm doing," he said aloud, his voice carried away by the wind that always seemed to blow across this hill. "I'm losing the farm. I've got a horse that might kill me. Victor's closing in, and I don't have a plan." The stones offered no answer, but then they never did. The dead couldn't solve the problems of the living. They could only witness, silent and patient, while those left behind struggled to find meaning in the wreckage. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, Walt made his way back down the hill. The stallion had finally approached the grain trough and was eating, his movements quick and nervous, ready to bolt at any threat. Walt watched from a distance, noting the way the horse's ribs showed through his hide, the hollows above his eyes that spoke of inadequate food and chronic stress. This animal had been failed by every human who'd encountered him. Beaten when he should have been gentled, starved when he should have been fed, confined when he needed space to run. The violence in him was taught, learned through brutal repetition that kindness was illusion and trust was weakness. Looking at him, Walt saw a mirror of his own spirit, something that had been broken so thoroughly it couldn't remember what wholeness felt like. Night fell slowly, the way it does in autumn, lingering at the edges of the world before finally surrendering to darkness. Walt stood on his porch and watched the stars emerge one by one. The same stars his great-grandfather had watched while building this farm, the same stars Margaret had loved to name on summer nights when they'd sit out here planning futures that would never arrive. The stallion moved restlessly in his corral, a shadow among shadows, and Walt felt the weight of all his failures pressing down. He'd failed to save his son. He'd failed to save his wife. He was failing to save his farm. Maybe trying to save this horse was just one more impossible task he'd take on and fail at, one more thing that would end in loss and regret. But as he stood there in the darkness, listening to the horse's movements, feeling the night air cold against his skin, Walt made a decision. He would try. He would fail probably, but he would try, because trying was all he had left, and giving up felt like dying while still drawing breath. Tomorrow would bring new troubles. Victor would pressure harder. The bank would move closer to foreclosure. The horse might never trust him, might never be more than a dangerous animal taking up space and resources Walt couldn't spare. But tonight, in this moment, man and horse were both still here, both still breathing, both still capable of one more day. And sometimes, Walt thought as he finally turned to go inside, sometimes that has to be enough. Dawn arrived with the kind of cold that makes a man question his choices. Walter Bennett woke to frost coating the windows in delicate patterns that reminded him of ferns, and for a moment before full consciousness returned, he forgot where he was in time. The bedroom could have belonged to any of the last 40 years, and Margaret might have been downstairs already, humming while she made breakfast, the smell of coffee and bacon rising through the floorboards. Then reality settled back over him like a familiar coat, worn and heavy, and he remembered. The empty house, the mounting debts, the black stallion waiting in the corral. He pushed himself upright and dressed quickly, layering against the cold that had settled into the old farmhouse during the night. His breath misted in the bedroom air, and he could hear the furnace struggling in the basement, burning oil he couldn't afford to replace. In the kitchen, he filled the percolator and set it on the stove, then stood at the window while waiting for it to boil. The world outside was transformed by frost, every surface glittering in the early light. The pastures stretched away white and pristine, untouched except for the dark line of his boot prints from yesterday. Beyond the barn, he could just make out the corral and the shape of the stallion, already awake, already standing at attention as if sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford. Walt poured his coffee into the same chipped mug he'd used for 30 years, the handle worn smooth by his grip, and carried it to the table. The photographs looked down at him from every wall, a gallery of what had been. Margaret at 23, her wedding dress simple but beautiful, her smile holding all the hope that young love carries. Thomas at every age, crawling, walking, riding his first bicycle, graduating high school. The Bennett family through the decades, captured in moments that felt both impossibly distant and heartbreakingly close. He picked up the photograph of Margaret that sat on the table, the one taken just months before the diagnosis. They'd driven to the lake that day, one of those spontaneous trips she loved, and spent the afternoon walking the shore. Her hair had been gray by then, lines had marked her face, but to Walt she'd been as beautiful as the day they'd married. In the photo, she was laughing at something he'd said, her head thrown back, joy captured in black and white. 42 years, he said to the image. 42 years, and it still doesn't feel like enough. They'd met at a county dance when he was 21 and she was 19, both of them awkward and unsure on the dance floor. She'd stepped on his foot during the first waltz, and instead of apologizing, she'd laughed. And that laugh had opened something in his chest he hadn't known was closed. They'd courted for 8 months before he'd worked up the courage to propose, kneeling in the mud of the spring garden while she planted tomatoes, the ring hidden in his pocket for 3 weeks while he waited for the perfect moment that never came. She'd said yes before he'd finished asking, dirt on her hands and tears on her cheeks, and they'd married that summer in the small church in Meadowbrook. The farm had been in better shape then, his parents still alive and working the land alongside them. They'd built a life here, season by season, year by year, their roots growing deeper into the Kentucky soil with every harvest. Thomas had been born during a snowstorm in February, arriving 3 weeks early and in such a hurry that the doctor barely made it in time. Walt had paced the downstairs while Margaret labored upstairs, his mother and the midwife attending her, and when he'd finally heard his son's first cry, he'd wept with relief and terror at the responsibility of it all. They'd named him after Walt's grandfather, hoping the name would carry strength and character, and for 19 years it had. Walt set the photograph down carefully and moved to the window again. The sun had cleared the horizon now, turning the frost to fire, each blade of grass ignited with light. He remembered teaching Thomas to ride in the south pasture, the boy fearless at 5 years old, laughing as the pony trotted in circles. Margaret had watched from the fence, her hand shading her eyes, calling warnings that neither of them heeded. Thomas had fallen twice that day, getting back up each time with grass stains on his jeans and determination on his face. The boy had loved this farm with the intensity of youth that sees possibility in everything. He'd planned to take it over someday, had studied agriculture at the community college, had ideas about crop rotation and sustainable practices that Walt had only half understood. But Thomas had also been young and restless, caught between love of the land and curiosity about the world beyond it. The night he died, he'd been driving home from Lexington, from a girl Walt had never met, and the roads had been slick with October rain. The state trooper had come to the door at 2 in the morning. Walt had known before the man spoke, had seen it in his face, in the way he removed his hat and held it against his chest. Margaret had made a sound Walt had never heard before and never wanted to hear again. Something between a wail and a whisper, grief given voice. They'd identified the body together, holding hands in the cold fluorescent light of the morgue, looking down at their son's face, peaceful in death in a way that made the violence of his passing all the more obscene. Margaret had never been the same after. The light in her dimmed, not extinguished but banked low, and though she smiled and cooked and tended her garden, there was a distance in her eyes, as if part of her remained with Thomas in whatever place the dead inhabit. When the cancer came 10 years later, Walt had wondered if she'd simply worn herself down with grief, if the loss of their son had weakened something essential that the disease exploited. He tried to be strong through her illness, had driven her to every appointment, had sat through every treatment, had held her hand while poison dripped into her veins in the hope of buying more time. The doctors had been optimistic at first, talking about survival rates and treatment protocols, but the cancer had been aggressive, and the optimism had faded with each scan that showed new growth, new spread, new failure. The last months had been the hardest. Margaret in pain despite the medication, her body failing while her mind remained sharp, aware of every indignity, every loss. She'd made him promise not to let the farm go, had gripped his hand with surprising strength and made him swear he'd keep it in the family, keep the Bennett name on the deed. He'd promised because he'd have promised her anything in those final days, would have sworn to move mountains or stop the sun if she'd asked. When she died, it had been quietly, in the early morning, sunlight just beginning to touch the bedroom walls. Walt had been dozing in the chair beside the bed and had woken to silence, to the absence of her labored breathing, and had known before checking that she was gone. He'd sat with her for an hour, holding her hand as it cooled, memorizing her face one last time, before finally calling the funeral home. The sound of a truck on the gravel drive pulled Walt from his memories. He wiped his eyes, surprised to find them wet, and moved to the door. Marcus Webb climbed out of a battered pickup that had seen better decades. A lean man in his 70s with silver hair pulled back in a ponytail, and eyes that carried the wisdom of someone who'd spent a lifetime reading the language of animals. Marcus had been a veterinarian before retirement, though retirement for him meant doing the same work for less money, helping farmers who couldn't afford full fees. He'd tended the Bennett livestock for 30 years, had been there for difficult births and emergency calls, had put down the animals that couldn't be saved with a gentleness that honored their lives. Walt had called him yesterday, after Lillian left, needing someone who'd understand what he was attempting with the Stallion. "Morning, Walt," Marcus said, his voice carrying the rough texture of a lifetime of smoking before he'd quit. "Heard you've taken in some trouble." "That's one way to put it." Walt led him toward the corral, where the black stallion stood watching their approach with ears pinned flat. Marcus stopped at the fence and studied the horse in silence, his experienced eye taking in every detail. The scars that marked the animal's hide, the way he held his weight ready to explode into motion, the intelligence and calculation in those dark eyes. After a long moment, Marcus let out a low whistle. "That's a lot of trauma standing on 4 legs, he said quietly. "What's his story?" Walt recounted what little he knew, James Pritchard's description of the attacks, the owner who'd given up, the decision to destroy an animal deemed too dangerous to live. Marcus listened without interrupting, his gaze never leaving the stallion. "He's been systematically abused," Marcus said when Walt finished. "You can see it in how he carries himself, always ready for the blow he knows is coming. Whoever had him before broke something fundamental. The question is whether it can be repaired." "You think it can?" Marcus was quiet, considering. "I've seen horses come back from remarkable things, but I've also seen animals so damaged they never trust again, never connect. This one's right on that edge." He turned to look at Walt directly. "The real question is whether you're in a position to do this work. It'll take months, maybe years. Patience you might not have, given everything else you're dealing with." Walt had known Marcus long enough to hear what wasn't being said. The older man knew about the debts, the pressure from Victor Drummond, the foreclosure looming. The whole county knew, in the way small communities know everything about their members. There were no secrets here, only things people were polite enough not to mention. "I've got time," Walt said, the lie sitting heavy on his tongue. Marcus studied him with those knowing eyes. "Margaret made you promise to keep this place, didn't she?" The directness of the question caught Walt off guard. He nodded, unable to speak. "And you think saving this horse is somehow connected to keeping that promise?" It wasn't a question. "Maybe," Walt admitted. "Or maybe I just can't stomach watching another thing die because it's inconvenient." Marcus laid a hand on Walt's shoulder, the gesture carrying decades of friendship. "All right then, let's see what we can do." They spent the next hour discussing strategy. Marcus explained the principles of natural horsemanship, the importance of reading the animal's body language, of responding to fear with patience rather than force. He talked about pressure and release, about creating situations where the horse could make choices that led to positive outcomes, slowly building trust through consistency and respect. The key is making yourself the safest thing in his world, Marcus said. Right now, he sees threat everywhere. Your job is to be so predictable, so non-threatening, that eventually being near you becomes preferable to being alone. After Marcus left, Walt began implementing the approach they'd discussed. He moved slowly around the corral, never approaching the stallion directly but making his presence constant. He cleaned the water trough, filled the feed bucket, mucked out the section near the gate. The horse tracked every movement, muscles tense, but he didn't attack. Small progress, but progress nonetheless. By midday, Walt's back ached from the work, and he retreated to the porch to rest. The stallion had relaxed fractionally, enough to lower his head and nose at the grain, though he didn't eat while Walt watched. It was a beginning, fragile as new ice, but real. Lillian returned in the afternoon with more food and news from town. She bustled into the kitchen without knocking, as was her habit, and began unpacking groceries Walt hadn't asked for and couldn't pay for. "Before you start," she said, cutting off his protest. "This is from the church pantry. They had extra this month, and I volunteered to distribute it. So you're doing them a favor by taking it." The lie was transparent and kind. Walt accepted it because arguing would insult them both. "Victor's been at the diner," Lillian continued, "putting canned goods in the cupboard. Talking to anyone who'll listen about how dangerous your horse is, how you're risking the community by keeping it. He's building a case, Walt, trying to turn opinion against you." Walt felt anger simmer but kept his voice level. "Horse hasn't done anything. Doesn't matter. Victor's good at making people afraid. Fear makes folks do things they wouldn't otherwise consider, like supporting measures to have animals destroyed or property condemned." She turned to face him. "You need allies, Walt. People willing to speak up for you. I'm not asking people to choose sides. You won't have to ask. But you need to let them choose. Let them see what you're doing with that horse. Let them understand you're not being reckless." Her expression softened. Margaret was beloved in this town. People remember how she helped during hard times, how she taught Sunday school, how she organized the food drives. That goodwill extends to you, but you have to let people help. After Lillian left, Walt found himself back at the corral, watching the stallion move through the space. The horse had a particular way of carrying himself, proud despite everything, unbowed even in captivity. There was nobility in that refusal to surrender, a kind of courage that Walt recognized because he felt it flickering in himself, fragile but persistent. As evening approached, Walt brought his guitar out to the porch, something he hadn't done since Margaret's funeral. He tuned it slowly, fingers remembering patterns they'd played 1,000 times, and began to pick out a melody she'd loved. The music drifted across the yard, simple and sad, and he played without thinking, letting the notes carry memory and longing. In the corral, the black stallion's ears pricked forward. The tension in his posture eased slightly, and he moved closer to the fence nearest the porch, drawn by the sound. Walt kept playing, offering this gift of music, this evidence that not all human presence meant pain. The sun set in glory, the sky ablaze with colors that seemed impossible, and Walt played until his fingers ached and the stars emerged. The stallion stood at the fence, head lowered, breathing slowly, and for the first time since arriving, he looked almost peaceful. Walt set the guitar aside and spoke into the growing darkness. "I don't know your name, what you were called before, but here, if you'll stay, I'll call you Midnight, because that's when things are darkest, but also when morning's closest." The horse didn't respond, of course, but his ears remained forward, listening, and Walt chose to take that as acceptance. They were both broken things trying to survive the night, both carrying wounds that might never fully heal, but in this moment, under these stars, they were together in their brokenness, and that felt like a kind of grace. The October sun climbed higher each day as if hurrying toward winter, and Walter Bennett marked time by the incremental changes in the black stallion he'd named Midnight. 3 weeks had passed since the horse arrived, 3 weeks of patience and routine, of showing up every morning regardless of weather or mood, of being present without demanding anything in return. The first breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning when fog hung low over the pastures. Walt had entered the corral for the first time, moving slowly, keeping his body angled away from the horse in a posture that signaled no threat. Midnight had retreated to the far corner, snorting, pawing the ground in warning, but he hadn't charged. Walt had simply stood near the gate, breathing slowly, letting 5 minutes stretch into 10, then 15, before backing out the way he'd come. Each day after, he'd repeated the process, entering the corral, standing in place, then leaving. Gradually, the distance between them shrank. Midnight stopped retreating, though his muscles remained coiled, ready. By the end of the second week, Walt could stand in the center of the corral for half an hour while the horse circled, always watching, always measuring, but no longer panicking at the intrusion. The work was exhausting in ways that had nothing to do with physical labor. It required absolute control of his own fear, his own frustration, his own need to rush the process. Horses read human emotion like some men read words, and any spike of anger or impatience would undo days of progress. So Walt learned to empty himself before entering the corral, to leave his worries about money and foreclosure and Victor Drummond outside the fence, to be nothing but calm presence. But the world beyond the corral wouldn't be ignored. The letters from the bank grew more urgent, the language shifting from polite reminders to legal warnings. Victor's attorney sent papers outlining the foreclosure timeline, offering one last chance to sell before the property went to auction. The date circled in red was November 15th, less than 4 weeks away. Walt had spread these documents across the kitchen table one night, trying to find some angle he'd missed, some option he hadn't considered. The numbers were brutal in their clarity. He owed more than the farm was worth in its current state, more than he could possibly earn in the time remaining. Even if he sold everything, the livestock, the equipment, the furniture, he'd still fall short. Sleep came poorly those nights. He'd lie awake listening to the house settle, to the wind testing the windows, and think about his great-grandfather clearing this land with an axe and a mule. That man had started with nothing but will and muscle, had carved a farm from wilderness through decades of work that would break most modern men. And now Walt, for generations later, was going to be the one who lost it. The shame of that failure ate at him. He'd look at Margaret's photograph and feel the weight of his broken promise. He'd pass Thomas's room, still unchanged after 12 years, and feel the crushing absence of the future they'd planned. Some mornings it took everything he had to get out of bed, to face another day of trying to save things that seemed determined to slip away. But then he'd walk out to the corral and see Midnight waiting, and something would shift. The horse was changing, slowly but undeniably. His coat had started to shine with better nutrition, the hollows above his eyes filling in. He no longer flinched at every sound, no longer spent his energy in constant vigilance. He'd begun to investigate his surroundings, nosing at the fence posts, pawing at interesting patches of ground, behaving less like a prisoner and more like a creature finding its place. One morning, Walt arrived at the corral to find Midnight standing at the gate, waiting. It was such a small thing, but it stopped Walt in his tracks. The horse wasn't cowering or preparing to flee. He was present, engaged, curious about what the day would bring. When Walt entered with the feed bucket, Midnight approached within 6 feet and stopped, close enough that Walt could see the flecks of amber in his dark eyes, could count the individual scars that marked his hide. They stood that way for several minutes, man and horse studying each other, neither moving. Walt could hear the horse's breathing, steady and deep, could smell the warm animal scent of him. Then, slowly, Walt extended his hand, palm up, fingers loose. He didn't reach toward the horse, didn't move closer, just offered the possibility of connection. Midnight's nostrils flared, testing the air. His ears flicked forward and back, processing information, calculating risk. Walt kept his breathing even, his posture relaxed, making himself as unthreatening as stone. The moment stretched, brittle as old glass, and then Midnight took a single step forward and touched his nose to Walt's palm. The contact lasted perhaps 3 seconds before the horse jerked back, startled by his own boldness. But those 3 seconds rewrote everything. That voluntary touch, freely given, was trust manifesting in its most fragile form. Walt felt his throat tighten with emotion he couldn't name, a mixture of gratitude and hope and sorrow for all the time this animal had gone without such simple kindness. He left the corral without trying to repeat the contact, understanding instinctively that pushing would destroy what had been built. But he carried that moment with him through the rest of the day, a bright point against the darkness of his circumstances. Marcus Webb returned that afternoon, pulling up in his ancient truck just as Walt was mending fence near the road. The veterinarian climbed out slowly, joints protesting the cold that had settled in with October's final week, and walked over to where Walt worked. "Heard some things in town," Marcus said without preamble. "Victor's been talking to the county board about public safety ordinances, specifically about dangerous animals on residential properties." Walt drove another staple into the fence post, harder than necessary. "This isn't residential. It's agricultural. Lines get blurry when someone wants them to." Marcus leaned against the fence, his weathered face troubled. "He's also been in contact with James Pritchard, asking about the horse's history, getting documentation of the attacks, building a case that Midnight poses an ongoing threat. Has the horse done anything since being here? Has there been one incident, one complaint?" "No," Marcus admitted. "But Victor doesn't need facts. He needs fear, and he's good at selling it. He's got half the county believing you're harboring a killer animal out of stubbornness, that it's only a matter of time before someone gets hurt." Walt threw his hammer into the toolbox with enough force to make Marcus flinch. "That horse has been through hell. Every mean thing in his nature was taught by humans who should have known better. And now they want to destroy him because he had the audacity to fight back." "I know," Marcus said quietly, "but you need to understand what you're up against. Victor's positioned this as a choice between community safety and one man's pride. He's made you the villain, Walt." The word stung because Walt could see the strategy clearly. Victor was isolating him, turning neighbors into critics, making the farm and everything on it seem like a problem that needed solving. And the solution Victor offered was simple: sell the land, remove the dangerous horse, let someone responsible take over. That evening, Walt sat on his porch as darkness gathered, watching Midnight move through the corral in the fading light. The horse had a particular grace when he thought no one was watching, a fluid beauty in his movements that spoke to the wild thing he'd once been before humans had tried to break him into submission. Walt thought about his own breaking, the incremental losses that had reshaped him into this diminished version of who he'd been. The son dead in twisted metal, the wife fading by degrees until cancer claimed what grief had already weakened, the farm slipping through his fingers despite every effort to hold on. He'd been broken as surely as Midnight, shaped by trauma into something hard and defensive, expecting pain from every direction. But sitting there, watching the horse, Walt realized something. Midnight was healing. Slowly, imperfectly, but undeniably. The violence was receding, replaced by something that might eventually become trust. If this damaged animal could find his way back from the edge, what did that say about Walt's own possibilities? The next morning brought Lillian, earlier than usual, her face tight with concern. She climbed the porch steps and handed Walt a newspaper folded to show an editorial piece. The headline read, "When Compassion Becomes Recklessness, the Danger of Keeping Violent Animals." Walt didn't need to read further to know what it said. Victor had taken his campaign public, using the newspaper he partially owned to shape the narrative. The article painted Walt as a well-meaning but irresponsible old man, clinging to a dangerous animal out of misplaced sentiment while putting his neighbors at risk. "There's going to be a county board meeting next week," Lillian said. "Victor's pushing for an emergency ordinance that would require any animal with a documented history of violence to be evaluated by the county. If they deem it a threat, immediate destruction." Walt felt the trap closing. The ordinance sounded reasonable on its surface about public safety, but it was aimed directly at Midnight. Victor would ensure the evaluation went only one way. "Is there anything I can do?" Walt asked, hating the helplessness in his voice. Lillian sat down beside him, her small hand finding his. "You could speak at the meeting. Tell them what you've accomplished with Midnight. Show them he's not the same horse that arrived here. Let people see the man I know, the one Margaret loved, the one who doesn't give up even when everything's stacked against him." Walt shook his head. "I'm not good with words, Lillian. Never have been. You don't need to be eloquent. You just need to be honest." She squeezed his hand. "Margaret used to say you had more integrity in your silence than most men had in all their talking. Let people see that." After she left, Walt walked out to the corral. Midnight approached the fence without hesitation now, no longer seeing Walt as threat. Walt climbed over and stood in the center of the space, and the horse came to him, stopping close enough to touch. Walt raised his hand slowly and laid it on Midnight's neck, feeling the warmth of living muscle, the steady pulse of blood beneath skin. "They want to take you from me," Walt said quietly. "They want to destroy you because it's easier than understanding you." He stroked the horse's neck, feeling Midnight lean into the touch. "I don't know how to stop them. I don't know how to save either of us." Midnight turned his head and rested his muzzle against Walt's chest, the gesture so trusting it brought tears to Walt's eyes. This animal who'd been brutalized into violence, who'd fought the world because the world had only shown him cruelty, was offering comfort to the man who'd shown him kindness. The reversal was complete and profound. Walt wrapped his arms around the horse's neck and let himself break, the sobs coming from somewhere deep and long denied. He wept for his son, for his wife, for the farm slipping away, for this horse who deserved better than the hand he'd been dealt. He wept for himself and all the ways he'd failed to be what was needed. Midnight stood still through it all, patient and present, until Walt's tears ran dry and the shaking subsided. When Walt finally pulled back, the horse's dark eyes held something that looked remarkably like understanding. The days until the county meeting passed in a blur of preparation. Walt rehearsed what he might say, writing and discarding a dozen different versions. Marcus came by to offer support and strategy, explaining how to frame the argument in terms the board would respond to: rehabilitation versus destruction, responsibility versus fear. On the night before the meeting, Walt couldn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table with Margaret's photograph, running his thumb across the glass that separated them. "I'm going to fail you," he said to her image. "I'm going to lose the farm. I'm probably going to lose Midnight too. I don't know how to win this." Her photographed face smiled back, frozen in a moment of joy, and Walt remembered something she'd said during one of their last conversations. She'd been weak by then, the cancer having stolen most of her strength, but her mind had remained sharp. "Winning isn't always about keeping everything," she told him. "Sometimes it's about knowing what matters most and holding that, even if you have to let everything else go." He'd asked her what mattered most, and she'd touched his face with a hand that trembled. "That you keep trying. That you don't let the losses make you mean or small. That you stay the man I married, the one who believes broken things can heal." Walt set the photograph down gently and walked out into the night. The stars burned cold and distant above, indifferent to human struggle. In the corral, Midnight stood waiting, and Walt climbed in to stand beside him. The horse pressed against his side, solid and warm, and they stood together in the darkness, two broken things refusing to surrender. The county meeting hall was packed when Walt arrived the next evening. He dressed in his Sunday clothes, the same suit he'd worn to Margaret's funeral, and he felt awkward and constricted in the formal wear. Lillian met him at the door, along with Marcus and several other faces he recognized from church, from the feed store, from years of living in this community. Victor Drummond sat in the front row, flanked by his attorney and James Pritchard. They looked confident, prepared, certain of their victory. When the board chairman called the meeting to order and announced the first item of business, the proposed animal safety ordinance, Victor stood to speak. He was eloquent and persuasive, painting a picture of a community at risk, of children who played near properties where dangerous animals were kept, of the liability they all faced if something terrible happened. He presented documentation of Midnight's attacks, medical reports from the man hospitalized in Lexington, testimony from handlers who'd been injured. He made it sound reasonable and necessary, a simple matter of protecting people. Then he turned and pointed at Walt. Mr. Bennett is a good man who's suffered tremendous loss. We all sympathize with his grief. But sympathy can't override our responsibility to keep this community safe. His attachment to this animal, while understandable, puts us all at risk. The ordinance we're proposing isn't punitive. It's protective. It ensures that animals with violent histories are properly evaluated before they can harm anyone else. The board members nodded, some taking notes, and Walt felt the weight of the decision already made. They'd vote for the ordinance, midnight would be evaluated, and the outcome was predetermined. Victor had won before Walt even spoke. When the chairman asked if anyone else wished to comment, Lillian stood and walked to Walt's side. Then Marcus rose and joined them. One by one, others from the community stood, forming a quiet line of support that wound through the hall. Walt felt his throat tighten at the sight. He walked to the front and faced the board, his prepared speech evaporating from his mind. For a long moment he stood silent, and he could see Victor's smile beginning to form. Then Walt began to speak, not the words he'd rehearsed, but the truth as he understood it. "That horse came to me dying," he said, his voice rough but steady. "Not dying in body, but in spirit. Everything human had taught him that kindness was a trap, that trust led to pain. And you know what? He was right to think that, because now you want to kill him for having the courage to survive what we did to him." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I've lost everything that mattered to me. My son, my wife, this farm that's been in my family for 4 generations. I wake up every day wondering why I'm still here, what I'm supposed to do with the time I've got left. And then I work with that horse and I understand." Walt looked directly at Victor. "You think I'm keeping him out of stubbornness or sentiment? You're wrong. I'm keeping him because throwing away something broken instead of trying to heal it is how we got here in the first place. It's how we lose everything worth keeping." He turned back to the board. "Vote how you will. Pass your ordinance. But understand what you're really voting for. You're voting to make fear more important than hope. You're voting to destroy instead of repair. And if that's who we are as a community, then maybe we deserve what we're becoming." Walt walked back to his seat amid total silence. The board members exchanged glances, uncomfortable now, the certainty of their position shaken. Victor stood to respond, but the chairman held up a hand. "I think we've heard enough for tonight," he said. "We'll take this under advisement and vote at next month's meeting." It was a postponement, not a victory, but it was time Walt hadn't expected to have. As people filed out, several stopped to shake his hand, to tell him they'd spoken truth, to offer support. Victor left quickly, his expression tight with anger. Outside, under stars that seemed impossibly bright, Lillian hugged Walt fiercely. "Margaret would be proud," she whispered. Walt drove home through darkness that felt less oppressive than it had in months. At the farm, he went directly to the corral. Midnight was waiting, and when Walt climbed in, the horse came to him immediately. Walt pressed his face against Midnight's neck and felt the animal's steady heartbeat against his cheek. "We bought some time," he said. "I don't know if it's enough. Don't know if anything I do will be enough. But we're still here, and that counts for something." The horse nickered softly, and Walt stayed there until cold drove him inside. He slept better that night than he had in weeks, and when morning came, he rose with something that felt almost like purpose. The path forward remained unclear, the outcome uncertain. But for now, in this moment, broken things were healing, and that would have to be enough. November arrived with weather that couldn't decide what it wanted to be, warm afternoons giving way to nights cold enough to frost the grass. Walter Bennett had fallen into a rhythm with Midnight that felt less like training and more like conversation, each day building on the language they were developing together. The horse no longer saw him as threat, and the transformation was visible in every interaction. Walt could enter the corral now, and Midnight would approach immediately, seeking contact, pressing his muzzle into Walt's chest or shoulder in gestures that spoke of trust earned through patience. They'd progressed to the point where Walt could run his hands over the horse's entire body, checking for injuries, feeling the muscles that had filled out with proper feeding, tracing the scars that mapped a history of cruelty. But something else was happening, something Walt couldn't quite articulate. Midnight had begun behaving strangely at certain times, particularly in the early morning and late evening. He'd stand at the northwestern corner of the corral, the section nearest the old stone well that had been on the property since Walt's great-grandfather's time, and paw at the ground with an insistence that seemed purposeful. The first time Walt noticed it, he'd dismissed it as the horse simply testing the earth, perhaps finding a softer spot to stand. But the behavior repeated with such regularity that it became impossible to ignore. Every morning, Midnight would make his way to that corner and strike the ground with his right front hoof, the sound hollow and resonant, echoing in a way that made Walt's skin prickle. It reminded him uncomfortably of something Margaret used to say about animals knowing things humans had forgotten, about them being attuned to rhythms and presences invisible to modern sensibilities. She'd believed the land held memory, that places where significant things had happened retained an imprint that sensitive creatures could detect. Walt had always nodded along with these ideas without fully embracing them, trapped in the practical mindset of a farmer who dealt with soil composition and rainfall rather than spiritual mysteries. But watching Midnight's behavior, seeing the deliberateness of it, he found himself reconsidering. The stone well itself was a relic from the farm's earliest days, hand-dug through limestone bedrock by men with nothing but picks and determination. Walt's grandfather had told stories about its construction, about how they dug for weeks before hitting water, about the celebration when that first cold spring had bubbled up from the depths. The well had served the farm for decades before modern drilling had reached deeper aquifers, and eventually it had been capped and abandoned, nothing more than a historical marker of harder times. On a Tuesday morning, with mist hanging low over the pastures, Walt stood at the corral fence and watched Midnight perform his ritual. The horse moved to the corner with purpose, lowered his head as if listening, then struck the ground 3 times in succession. The sound carried across the still air, and Walt felt something shift in his chest, a recognition he couldn't name. He climbed into the corral and walked toward the spot, and Midnight moved aside to make room, watching Walt with those intelligent eyes. Walt knelt and pressed his palm flat against the earth where the horse had been striking. The ground felt different here, cooler than the surrounding soil, and when he leaned close, he caught a faint scent, metallic and sharp, like pennies left in rain. Standing, Walt looked around, orienting himself. The old well was perhaps 15 feet from where he stood, its stone cap visible through the weeds that had grown up around it. But the limestone that underlay this entire region was riddled with fissures and caves, underground rivers that connected in ways no one had fully mapped. It was possible, he supposed, that whatever Midnight was sensing had to do with water moving through rock somewhere below. He left the corral and walked to the barn, returning with a shovel. Midnight watched with interest as Walt began to dig where the horse had been pawing. The first few inches of topsoil came away easily, dark and rich, but beneath that he hit clay, pale and dense, the kind that turned to concrete when dry and soup when wet. Walt dug for 20 minutes, working up a sweat despite the morning cold, creating a hole perhaps 2 feet deep and 3 feet across. The clay gave way gradually to something else, a layer of soil that was darker, almost black, and had a strange oily texture that coated the shovel blade. He stopped digging and knelt at the edge of the hole, reaching down to scoop up a handful of the dark earth. It was cool and slick between his fingers, and the metallic smell was stronger here, mixed with something organic, like decaying leaves or old wood. Walt couldn't identify it, had never encountered soil quite like this in 40 years of farming. Midnight had moved closer, standing at the edge of the hole, and when Walt looked up at him, the horse's ears were pricked forward, his entire attention focused on what had been unearthed. There was something almost eager in his posture, as if Walt had finally understood a message the horse had been trying to communicate. "What is it, boy?" Walt asked, his voice sounding strange in the morning quiet. "What are you trying to show me?" The horse nickered softly and pawed at the edge of the hole, sending a small cascade of dirt sliding down. Walt scooped up more of the dark soil, studying it in the strengthening light. It didn't look like anything valuable, didn't glitter with gold or shimmer with oil, but it felt significant in a way he couldn't explain. He was still kneeling there, dirt under his fingernails and questions multiplying in his mind, when he heard a vehicle approaching. Looking toward the drive, he saw Marcus Webb's truck pulling in, earlier than the veterinarian's usual visits. Walt stood, wiping his hands on his jeans, and walked to meet him. Marcus climbed out with a newspaper in his hand, his expression grim. "You need to see this," he said without preamble, handing over the paper folded to show the front page. The headline made Walt's stomach drop: County Board schedules emergency session on animal safety ordinance. The article detailed how Victor Drummond had petitioned for an accelerated timeline, citing what he called mounting concerns about the dangerous horse on the Bennett property. The vote was scheduled for Friday, 4 days away. "He's not giving you any time to prepare," Marcus said. "He wants this done before you can rally more support or demonstrate Midnight's progress." Walt read through the article, seeing his name mentioned multiple times, always in the context of being well-meaning but reckless, sympathetic but dangerous. Victor had given quotes about community safety and difficult decisions, positioning himself as the reluctant voice of reason forced to act for the greater good. "There's more," Marcus continued. "Victor's filed a formal complaint with Animal Control, claiming Midnight poses an imminent threat. If the ordinance passes Friday, they could move to seize the horse as early as next week." The words felt like blows. Walt folded the newspaper slowly, trying to keep his hands from shaking. "Can they do that? Just take him?" "If the ordinance gives them authority, yes. And from what I'm hearing, it will." Marcus glanced toward the corral where Midnight stood watching them. "That horse has come so far, Walt. Anyone with eyes can see he's not the same animal that arrived here. But Victor's not interested in redemption stories. He wants your land, and he'll use any lever he can find." Walt thought about the dark soil in the hole he just dug, about Midnight's strange insistence on that particular spot, about Margaret's belief that the land held secrets. None of it made sense, but then very little in his life made sense anymore. "I need to understand something," he said to Marcus. "Come look at this." He led the veterinarian to the corral and showed him what he'd uncovered. Marcus knelt at the edge of the hole, examining the dark soil with the careful attention he'd once given to sick animals. He smelled it, rubbed it between his fingers, even touched a tiny amount to his tongue before spitting it out. "That's unusual," Marcus said finally. "This soil is rich in minerals, much more than the surrounding earth. And there's organic content that's been broken down almost completely." He stood, brushing off his knees. "It's like something was buried here and decomposed over a very long time, leaving behind concentrated nutrients." "Something like what?" Marcus shrugged. "Could be anything. A fallen tree, animal remains, even an old midden heap if Native Americans used this area. The limestone underneath would affect how things broke down, might even draw minerals up from deeper layers." He looked at Walt curiously. "Why were you digging here?" Walt explained Midnight's behavior, the repeated pawing, the insistence that had finally prompted him to investigate. Marcus listened without judgment, though his expression remained skeptical. "Horses are sensitive to things we can't perceive," Marcus said carefully. "Changes in air pressure before storms, subtle vibrations in the ground, even magnetic fields affect them. Maybe Midnight was detecting something about the soil composition, or maybe he just found a comfortable spot to stand." He paused. "Or maybe Margaret was right, and animals know things we've forgotten." After Marcus left, promising to attend Friday's meeting and speak on Walt's behalf, Walt returned to the hole. He dug deeper, working until his back ached and sweat soaked his shirt despite the November chill. At 3 feet down, the shovel struck something solid, producing a dull clank that made his heart jump. Walt dropped to his knees and used his hands to clear away the dark soil, revealing stone. But not natural stone, this was worked, shaped, the edges too precise to be random geology. He cleared more dirt, following the lines of the stone, and slowly a shape emerged. It was rectangular, perhaps 3 feet long and 2 feet wide, made of limestone blocks fitted together with skill. His great-grandfather had been a stone mason before turning to farming, had built the foundation of the house and the barn with blocks he'd cut himself. This work had the same signature, the same precise fitting that required no mortar because the stones themselves locked together perfectly. Walt sat back on his heels, breathing hard, trying to understand what he was seeing. A stone box, buried deliberately, marked by nothing above ground but now revealed by a horse's insistence. Inside could be anything or nothing. It might be a property marker, a time capsule, the foundation of some long-demolished structure. Midnight had moved to stand directly beside the hole, looking down at what had been uncovered. The horse's breathing was steady, his ears forward, and there was something in his posture that suggested satisfaction, as if this was exactly what he'd been trying to communicate. Walt worked at the edges of the stone box, trying to find a way to open it, but the blocks were fitted so tightly that nothing short of a pry bar would separate them. The sun had climbed toward noon, and Walt was exhausted from digging, but he couldn't leave this mystery unsolved. He went to the barn and gathered tools, returning with a crowbar, a sledgehammer, and a flashlight. Working carefully, mindful not to damage whatever might be inside, he inserted the crowbar into a hairline crack between the top stone and the side. He leveraged his weight against it, and with a grinding sound that set his teeth on edge, the stone shifted. It took another 20 minutes of careful work to lift the top stone free, revealing the dark interior of the box. Walt shone the flashlight into the opening, and his breath caught. Inside, wrapped in what looked like oilskin that had somehow survived decades underground, was a metal box, its surface tarnished but intact. He reached in and lifted it out, surprised by its weight. The box was perhaps a foot square and 6 inches deep, made of tin that had once been painted but now showed only patches of faded color. There was no lock, just a simple clasp that opened with some persuasion, and when Walt lifted the lid he found papers. They were in remarkable condition, protected by the oilskin and the sealed stone chamber from moisture and decay. Walt carefully removed the top document and unfolded it, recognizing his great-grandfather's handwriting, the precise script of a man educated in an era when penmanship mattered. The date at the top was 1889, and the document appeared to be a deed or contract of some kind. Walt's hands shook as he read, the formal language difficult to parse but the essential meaning clear enough. It was a mineral rights agreement, signed by his great-grandfather and witnessed by 2 other men whose names Walt didn't recognize. Beneath this were more documents, surveys and assessments, letters from mining companies, assay reports that used technical language Walt barely understood. But certain words leaped out at him: copper deposits, iron ore, significant commercial potential. There were maps showing the property boundaries and marking specific locations with X's and notations about depth and quality. Walt sat in the dirt beside the open stone box with these documents spread around him, trying to comprehend what he was seeing. His great-grandfather had discovered mineral deposits on this land over a century ago, had documented them carefully, but had apparently never exploited them. The final document in the box was a letter, and as Walt read it, tears began to stream down his face. The letter was addressed to future generations of the Bennett family, and it explained everything. His great-grandfather wrote about discovering the minerals shortly after purchasing the land, about receiving offers from mining companies that would have made him wealthy. But he'd refused them all, and the letter explained why. This land was bought with the sweat of honest labor, he'd written in that precise hand. It was cleared and planted to provide for my family and to leave something of value to those who come after. The minerals beneath it are part of that legacy, but they are not its heart. The heart of this land is the life it supports, the crops it grows, the animals it feeds. Mining would destroy all of that, would turn living soil into dead rock, would sacrifice the future for immediate gain. The letter went on to explain that he'd documented the minerals and buried the documents in case future generations needed them, but he hoped they never would. He hoped the farm itself would be enough, that the steady work of growing food and raising animals would sustain the Bennett name through the generations. But if times become so hard that you must choose between the land and survival, he'd written, then use what is here. Sell the rights or lease them, but do it knowing that you're trading permanence for necessity, that you're ending one story to begin another. Walt read the letter 3 times, tears blurring the words, before carefully folding it and placing it back in the tin box. He looked up at Midnight, who stood watching with those dark, knowing eyes, and laughed shakily. "You found this," he said to the horse. "Somehow you knew it was here, and you showed me." He stood on trembling legs and put his hand on Midnight's neck. "Margaret always said the land would provide if we listened. I guess she was right." The implications were staggering. If the assay reports were accurate, if the mineral deposits described in these century-old documents still existed, they could be worth enough to save the farm. More than save it, they could secure it for another century. But there was also the weight of his great-grandfather's warning, the knowledge that exploiting these minerals would change everything about this place. Walt gathered all the documents carefully, placed them back in the tin box, and carried it to the house. He spread them on the kitchen table and studied them for hours, trying to understand the technical language, to assess whether any of this information was still relevant. Mining technology had changed dramatically in 130 years. What had seemed valuable then might be worthless now, or vice versa. He needed expert advice, someone who understood mineral rights and mining operations, someone who could tell him if this discovery meant salvation or just another cruel hope. Marcus would know who to contact, or maybe there was someone at the university who specialized in such things. But even as Walt considered the practical steps, he felt the weight of the decision pressing down. His great-grandfather had chosen the long view, had sacrificed wealth for sustainability, had believed that preserving the land's life was more important than extracting its treasure. Was Walt prepared to make a different choice, to be the Bennett who broke that legacy? Night had fallen by the time he finished examining all the documents. He made himself eat some of the food Lillian had brought, though it tasted like nothing, and then went back outside to the corral. Midnight was resting, lying down in a way that showed complete trust, vulnerable in sleep because he no longer feared the night. Walt climbed into the corral and sat beside the horse, leaning back against that warm bulk, feeling Midnight's steady breathing. Above them, stars wheeled through their ancient patterns, and Walt thought about all the people who'd looked up at these same stars from this same land. His great-grandfather, seeing these constellations after a day of brutal labor. His parents, young and full of hope. Margaret, dying, finding comfort in their cold light. Thomas, never growing old enough to understand what they meant. "I don't know what to do," Walt whispered into the darkness. "I don't know if this is the answer or just another question." Midnight stirred slightly, shifting to press closer against Walt's side, offering the comfort of presence without words. And sitting there, under those infinite stars, with a horse that had led him to buried treasure, Walt felt something he'd almost forgotten. Not hope exactly, but possibility. The sense that the story wasn't finished, that the next chapter remained unwritten. Friday's meeting was 4 days away. The mineral rights documents were real. Victor Drummond's threats were real. Midnight's transformation was real. All of it was real, and all of it pulled Walt in different directions, each demanding a choice. He wasn't sure he was wise enough to make. But for tonight, he sat with a horse in the dark, and that was enough. Wednesday morning broke gray and threatening, clouds stacked overhead like stones ready to fall. Walter Bennett stood in his kitchen with the tin box open on the table, the mineral rights documents spread before him like a hand of cards he didn't know how to play. He'd barely slept, his mind churning through options that all seemed to lead nowhere good. The sound of tires on gravel announced a visitor before Walt was ready for company. He moved to the window and felt his jaw tighten. Victor Drummond's black luxury sedan was pulling into the drive, moving slowly as if savoring the approach. Walt had known this confrontation was coming, had felt it building like the pressure before a storm, but knowing didn't make it easier. He met Victor at the door before the man could knock, stepping out onto the porch and pulling the door closed behind him. Whatever happened next, he wouldn't let Victor Drummond inside the house Margaret had made a home. Victor climbed out of his car wearing a cashmere coat that probably cost more than Walt's truck. His shoes polished to a mirror shine despite the muddy drive. He smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes, which moved past Walt to assess the property with the calculating gaze of someone pricing merchandise. "Walt," Victor said, his voice smooth as expensive whiskey. "I hope you don't mind me dropping by unannounced. I thought we should talk before Friday's meeting." Nothing to talk about, Walt said, keeping his voice level. I'm not selling, and I'm not giving up my horse. Victor's smile widened slightly, as if Walt had said something amusing. I admire your conviction. I really do. But conviction doesn't pay mortgages, and it doesn't change the fact that you're out of time. He gestured toward the fields, the sagging fences, the barn that needed paint. Look around, Walt. This place is dying. You're one man trying to hold back the tide with his bare hands. My great-grandfather built this farm with his bare hands, Walt said. Seems like they're good enough to hold it. Victor pulled an envelope from his coat pocket, thick and official-looking. I'm prepared to make you a final offer. It's generous, Walt. More than generous. Enough to clear all your debts and leave you with money to start fresh somewhere else. Somewhere easier. He held out the envelope. Take it. Read the numbers. Think about what it means to walk away with dignity instead of being dragged away by foreclosure. Walt didn't take the envelope. What it means is you get my land for a fraction of what it's worth. What it means is 4 generations of Bennett history gets erased so you can build vacation homes for rich people from Louisville. I prefer to think of it as progress, Victor said, his tone turning colder. The world changes, Walt. Farms like this are relics. Too small to be profitable, too isolated to be practical. You're holding on to something that's already gone, you just haven't admitted it yet. Maybe I'm holding on to something you never had, Walt said. Something you couldn't buy if you had twice your money. Victor's pleasant mask slipped, revealing irritation underneath. Friday's meeting is going to pass that ordinance. You know it, I know it. Your horse will be evaluated and deemed a threat, and they'll take him. You'll have nothing but an empty corral and a farm you can't afford. Or you can sign this now, take the money, and at least save yourself that humiliation. Walt felt rage building in his chest, hot and dangerous, but he kept it locked down. Losing his temper would give Victor what he wanted, evidence that Walt was unstable, dangerous, unfit to keep the property. I'll see you Friday, Walt said quietly. At the meeting. Victor studied him for a long moment, then shrugged and tucked the envelope back into his coat. Your choice. But when the bank forecloses next month, when they auction this place off for pennies, remember I gave you a better option. Remember you chose pride over sense. He turned to go, then stopped and looked back. That horse of yours, the black one, I've heard he's calmed down considerably. Interesting how quickly dangerous animals become docile when they're facing destruction. Almost like they know what's coming. His smile returned, sharp and cold. See you Friday, Walt. Walt stood on the porch long after Victor's sedan disappeared down the drive, his hands clenched into fists, breathing slowly to calm the anger that wanted to explode. Victor's parting words had been calculated to wound, to suggest that Midnight's transformation was just an act, temporary behavior that would revert once the threat passed. But Walt knew better. He'd seen the change in the horse, not just in actions but in spirit. Midnight had been healed by patience and consistency, by being treated with respect instead of violence. That healing was real as the scars that marked his hide, and no amount of Victor's cynicism could diminish it. The first drops of rain began to fall as Walt walked out to the corral. Midnight was standing at his usual spot near where they dug up the stone box, and when he saw Walt approaching, the horse nickered in greeting. Walt climbed into the corral and went to stand beside him, rain beginning to fall harder now, soaking through his shirt. Victor thinks you're putting on a show, Walt said, running his hand down Midnight's neck. Thinks you're still the same scared, angry animal, just hiding it better. He looked into the horse's dark eyes. But I know different. I know what it costs to come back from being broken. I know you're not pretending. Midnight pressed his muzzle against Walt's chest, the gesture now familiar and comforting. They stood together in the rain, man and horse, while water ran down their faces and turned the ground beneath their feet to mud. By afternoon, the rain had settled into a steady downpour that drummed on the barn roof and turned the pastures into lakes. Walt was in the barn doing make-work, anything to keep his hands busy and his mind from circling the same desperate thoughts, when he heard another vehicle approaching. This time it was James Pritchard's truck, and the livestock broker climbed out quickly, hunching against the rain as he jogged to the barn entrance. He was carrying a folder under his coat, trying to keep it dry, and his expression was troubled. "Walt," he said by way of greeting, shaking water from his hat. "Got something you need to see. Couldn't wait till it stopped raining." Walt gestured him deeper into the barn, and James opened the folder on top of a hay bale. Inside were documents, official forms with county seals and legal terminology Walt had to squint to decipher. "Victor's attorney filed these this morning," James said. "It's a petition to have Midnight classified as a dangerous animal prior to Friday's meeting. If the county administrator approves it, they can seize him immediately, before the board even votes." Walt felt his stomach drop. "Can they do that?" "Technically, yes. If there's evidence of imminent danger, the administrator has emergency powers to remove animals pending a hearing." James ran a hand through his wet hair. "Victor's claiming that keeping Midnight violates existing statutes, that every day he's here is a risk to public safety. Based on what? He hasn't done anything since he arrived." "Based on his history before he came here," James said grimly. "The attacks are documented. Victor's arguing that rehabilitation isn't possible, that you're just delaying inevitable violence." He looked at Walt with genuine concern. "I'm sorry, Walt. I never should have brought you that horse. I thought I was giving him a chance, but all I did was give Victor ammunition against you." Walt shook his head. "You gave Midnight a chance at life. That's not something to apologize for." "But at what cost?" James gestured toward the house, toward the land beyond. "Victor's using him to destroy you. If you just let me put the horse down when I offered, none of this would be happening. And a living creature would be dead because it was inconvenient," Walt said flatly. "No, I won't regret saving him, whatever it costs me." After James left, Walt stood in the barn doorway watching rain fall in sheets across the property. Everything Victor had said was true in the worst way. The farm was failing. The debts were crushing, time was running out. A rational man would take the money, let the horse be destroyed, walk away from this doomed struggle. But Walt had never been particularly rational, and Margaret had loved him for it. She'd seen in his stubborn refusal to quit something she called integrity, though Walt had always thought of it as simple inability to know when he was beaten. Either way, it was part of him, woven too deeply to extract without unraveling everything else. The mineral rights documents upstairs offered a possible escape, but using them felt like betrayal. His great-grandfather had refused to exploit those resources, had chosen the harder path because he believed preserving the land's life mattered more than wealth. Could Walt honor that legacy while also using the documents to save the farm? He didn't have answers, only questions that multiplied with each passing hour. What he had was a horse that had learned to trust again, land that had been in his family for 4 generations, and 2 days until a meeting that would decide everything. That night, Walt sat at the kitchen table with the mineral rights documents and worked through calculations on a notepad. If the assays were accurate, if the deposits still existed, if modern mining methods could extract them economically, then leasing the mineral rights could generate enough income to save the farm. But those were 3 substantial ifs, any one of which could collapse his hopes. And even if everything worked perfectly, there was the question of time. Negotiating mineral rights leases, arranging for surveys and extraction, receiving actual money, all of that would take months at minimum. He had days before foreclosure, hours before Friday's meeting. The rain continued through the night, and Walt barely slept. He kept getting up to look out the window toward the corral, checking on Midnight, making sure the horse was all right. Each time, he saw the Stallion standing calmly despite the storm, no longer the panicked creature that had arrived 2 months ago. Thursday morning brought Sheriff Daniel Hayes, his cruiser pulling in just after dawn. Walt met him on the porch, already knowing this wasn't a social call. "Walt," Daniel said, removing his hat, "I've got papers from the county administrator." "I'm sorry." Walt took the documents Daniel held out, his hands remarkably steady despite the dread settling in his chest. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was clear. Midnight had been classified as a dangerous animal under emergency provisions. Walt had 24 hours to surrender the horse for evaluation, or authorities would seize him by force. Victor pushed this through, Daniel said quietly. Called in favors, applied pressure. The administrator didn't have much choice once Victor framed it as liability issue. There's always a choice, Walt said, but his voice carried no heat. I have to enforce this, Walt. If you don't bring the horse in tomorrow morning, I'll have to come get him. And I really don't want to do that. Walt looked past the sheriff toward the corral where Midnight stood watching them. He's not dangerous anymore. You can see that yourself. I know, Daniel said, but the classification is based on past behavior, not current. The law doesn't care about rehabilitation. He hesitated, then added, there might be a way to fight this. If you can get an independent evaluation, prove the horse is safe, the administrator might reverse the order. How long would that take? Days, maybe a week. And in the meantime, Midnight sits in a county holding facility, probably terrified, probably reverting to all the behaviors we've worked so hard to change. Walt shook his head. That's not mercy, Daniel. That's just cruelty with paperwork. After the sheriff left, Walt walked out to the corral through mud that sucked at his boots. Midnight came to him immediately, and Walt wrapped his arms around the horse's neck, breathing in the warm animal smell of him, feeling the solid life beneath his hands. They're coming for you tomorrow, he whispered, and I don't know how to stop them. The horse stood patient and trusting, and Walt felt something break inside him. He'd failed his son, hadn't been able to save him from bad roads and worse luck. He'd failed his wife, all his love and effort unable to stop cancer from stealing her away. Now he was failing Midnight, and the weight of it crushed him. But even in that crushing weight, something else stirred. Not hope, but something harder, more dangerous. Refusal. Simple, absolute refusal to let this happen without a fight. Walt pulled back and looked into Midnight's eyes. Tomorrow's the meeting. One way or another, we'll know by tomorrow night. Until then, you're safe here with me. Thunder rolled across the hills, and Midnight tossed his head but didn't shy. The storm that was coming had nothing to do with weather, and they both seemed to know it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.